towards the end of May, I did a second visit to the front line of the Donbass conflict with the same volunteer, Natalia Prylutskaya, who's from Kyiv. She's been going to the front line as a civil society volunteer for the last 2 years. She goes about twice a month. She's one of those very strong Ukrainian women like Nadiya Savchenko who are taking the fight to the enemy, as it were, and upon whom Ukrainian soldiers are highly reliant for a whole range of products that they collect from Ukrainian society, products that the government doesn't supply the troops on the front line. We went down this time with my nephew, Stefan Jajecznyk, from the UK, and 2 Italian journalists, taking down the same kind of things as before, as what she always takes down, ex-military uniforms from the West, British military uniforms, in fact, which are a lot better quality than Ukrainian, a lot cheaper than Ukrainian, and very important, they're fireproof. Also sleeping bags, military boots, food, medicines, night and heat vision, and some other small items as well. And each volunteer has a section of the ATO, the anti-terrorist operation, that they visit. So the Ukraine's volunteers who go to the front line cooperate with each other so there's no duplication, and each is responsible for a certain section of the front line. Typically, for example, we visited about 4 or 5 relatively small military bases and forward units. At times, we're talking about 800 to 900 meters from the front line, and we saw through a sniper rifle vision and through my camera Donetsk airport, which was about a kilometer and a half from where we were. The hottest area, the toughest and hottest place we went to was a nickname Shakhter. It's a destroyed coal mine. The real name is Butovka, and just last week 5 Pravii sector soldiers were killed there. And this was right close to the front line. These Pravii sector soldiers are fighting alongside the 128th battalion from what is based in Zakarpattia. Pravii sector guys don't get paid, and they're unrecognized by the Ukrainian government, and many of them are Russian speakers. So they're incredibly interesting. One of the Pravii sector guys we met at that particular place, which was hit and 5 were killed last week, was an ethnic Russian from Ukraine fighting in Pravii sector. And he was literally on the front line. When you looked over the parapet through a periscope, because you couldn't put your head up, you could see DNR and Russian flags. So what kind of feedback do you get from talking to the soldiers? Because remember, we're staying overnight with the soldiers in their bases. We're not staying in hotels. There are no hotels down there. Well, if I heard the same kind of things as I heard down there from soldiers on a British, Canadian, or an American military base, I would be very worried. I would be thinking of the soldiers committing some kind of act of sedition and treason. Because if I went to a Canadian or British military base and the soldiers just talked about their commander-in-chief and politicians in the way that Ukrainians talk about them, I think we'd all think there's a problem. Well, you might not be surprised to hear not a single soldier had a positive thing to say about President Petro Poroshenko. In fact, they talked about the fact that in their view there were 2 enemies they were fighting. One, which is Russia, of course, and the separatists and their proxies. And the second are what they say politicians and senior generals in Kyiv. They have no respect for the politicians, or for most of the politicians in Kyiv. particularly President Poroshenko, and they don't have any respect for the senior generals in Kyiv. The officers on the front line, which are medium-rank officers, kind of lieutenants, captains and such like, these are usually embedded with the soldiers and they fight with the soldiers and they have tremendous respect for those kind of officers. You see, by the way, also incredibly a lot of people still from the Euromaidan. They were volunteers on the Euromaidan or self-defense forces, and they went straight to fight in 2014, and they're still on the front line today, although some of them have been killed, of course. So they don't say anything positive. They think that the problem is as much with Kyiv as it is with the Russian separatist side. Some of them talked in very derogatory ways, particularly the Pravii sector soldiers, and that's to some degree understandable because Pravii sector, even though they've lost a lot of people and they do a lot of the really upfront fighting, and they're not paid, so they're not mercenaries, they're not recognized by the Ukrainian government, which is ridiculous, and which is bad for them because, for example, the families of the 5 who were killed last week, they received no state pension, therefore, or no compensation. So their wives and kids don't get anything from the Ukrainian government because the menfolk who died are fighting in a unit which is not recognized officially. They were very derogatory, of course, but the kind of things you would also hear is or lots of stories about corruption, which is kind of unpleasant to hear because many people are down there fighting as volunteers. There are medics down there, also volunteers, pensioners who were doctors and have gone down during their pension era. The pension years have gone down there to help. And some of the ambulances that we saw were just incredible, how disgusting. I mean, how can you send Soviet ambulances from the 80s, maybe even older, which had no equipment inside, to the front line? It's a fact that wounded soldiers have to be patched up in the first 2 hours after they're injured. After that, it's too late; they'll die. So it's critical that there is paramedics and paramedical equipment on the front line. Patch them up and then get them back to the rear lines where they can be worked on in proper medical facilities. So, of course, inevitably, if that's not being sent to the front line, the soldiers are going to be not very happy. And we heard a corruption story from a very credible person about the Ukrainian government assigning $2 million to buy 8 super-equipped Mercedes ambulances with all top-notch medical equipment inside. And the money did not end up buying that. It ended up buying luxury cars, and some people have actually seen those cars being driven around Kyiv. So that's the kind of stories you hear down there. What other kind of things did you hear? You hear that threats made against the commander-in-chief. Again, as I say, if this was on a Canadian or a British military base and you heard threats made by soldiers against Prime Minister Cameron or former Prime Minister Cameron as of today and Prime Minister Trudeau, you'd be worried. I'd be worried. I'd be, holy crap, this is just incredible. But this is Ukraine. And the kind of threats they were making were that if the president signed something to the advantage of Russia and the separatists, such as local elections, but more particularly special status for the Donbass, I quote and unquote, he will not get off the aeroplane. We'll come for him in Kyiv. We heard things such as like Yanukovych was allowed to get away. Poroshenko will not be allowed to get away from Kyiv. The president is obviously scared about this. There is a fear factor here. And that's obvious from a variety of things. As you drive around the Donbass with the volunteers, there are many roadblocks, understandably. This is a war zone. And particularly the National Guard soldiers will always ask you, the first thing they'll ask you is, are you carrying any weapons? They won't search the vehicle because they know that you're volunteers, but they will ask you that question. When the volunteers return to Kyiv, the police visit their homes. I saw that with Natalia's apartment, and they will also ask the same kind of questions. I don't think that they've been really that thorough in what they're asking. They've been obviously instructed to do this. It's a kind of a half-hearted attempt, I would say, on the part of the police and the National Guard to search for weapons. For example, there's still the intercity train from 3 stations in the Donbass back to Kyiv. This was the intercity train, the Hyundai trains built for the Euro 12 football tournament. It doesn't go to Donetsk anymore. It only goes as far as Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk. But there are no checks on that train, so you could take a bag of weapons or explosives on the train. I mean, there's no metal detectors or anything. So it's a bit typically Ukrainian, half-hearted. They're obviously worried because last August of 2015, a member of the Svoboda Sich battalion brought grenades to Kyiv, and he threw them during riots outside the Ukrainian parliament, and 3 National Guardsmen were killed. Very tragic and, I think, senseless killing of 3 guardsmen. If you have a squabble with politicians, you don't, use your fisticuffs, for Christ's sake. Don't use grenades against innocent conscripts who are just there because they're conscripts. So that was tragic. So obviously there's a fear factor there. I think what hurts the soldiers the most is that they're in this limbo land because they're in a situation with Minsk agreements whereby it's neither a war, but it's also not peace. Hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers have died, I believe, this year, if not at least since Minsk II was signed. So the war has continued. It hasn't ended with Minsk II. And obviously that's debilitating for Ukrainian soldiers because they don't really get proper kind of orders and instructions from Kyiv. The generals never visit them, they told me. But at the same time, so they don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. They can't really fire back. They can't really take the fight to the enemy. And so that kind of situation where neither side has won, but one side is not playing by the rules, is not good for morale. Because soldiers like to be given orders and they like to see action. They don't just like to be sitting around as sitting ducks. The soldiers do say that they really have only 2 choices. They have either one choice of trying to retake those territories or accepting the front line as the new de facto border, which is basically the argument made by, say, Western scholars such as Alexander Motyl, who are saying, to hell with that area controlled by the separatists, let it go to Russia, we'll just have a referendum maybe and create a new border. Because after all, they don't control the entire Donbass. They control about a third to a half of Donetsk and only a third of Luhansk. So you have, in this kind of situation, I think what Russia's doing is trying to wear the Ukrainians down. Can this go on indefinitely, where Ukrainian soldiers keep dying? And it's a big cost on the Ukrainian government. We're talking 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers on the eastern front line. So there's a cost involved, especially because many of them are no longer conscripts. These are kontratniki, and kontratniki are the same as professional soldiers in the West. They're paid more money. So that's a heavy burden on a very tight budget in Kyiv. But the upside to all of this is just the incredible patriotism of Ukrainian soldiers. And then forget the fact, as I wrote in Foreign Affairs this week, forget the fact about language. Language has nothing to do with it. You can have a room full of 50 Ukrainian soldiers, half speaking Russian, half speaking Ukrainian, and there's absolutely no problem at all. I've met soldiers who lived most of their lives in Russia because their fathers were in a Soviet kind of official position. They've come back to Ukraine to fight. I've met soldiers from Donetsk fighting on the Ukrainian side. You can meet ethnic Russians from Ukraine, like this Pravii sector volunteer. So the whole issue of nationality, language is not really the issue. The issue is more whether you, as a Russian speaker, have respect for Ukrainian and accept it as a bona fide second language of Ukraine, which deserves respect and support, or whether you believe in the old Soviet system where Ukrainian should be rubbished as a peasant tongue and Russian should be the dominant language, and that's the view of Russia and the separatist regions. So it's more a question of power and the relationship to language as opposed to whether you're a Ukrainian or Russian speaker. So ironically, the two groups who don't understand the concept of a patriotic Russian-speaking Ukrainian, are the Russian leaders in Moscow and the Ukrainian diaspora. They're both the same. They both can't get their heads around this concept because on the one hand, in Russia, every Russian speaker, ruskoязычный, every Russian speaker equals a Russian in the eyes of Putin. And they're called compatriots. They're all ethnic Russians. Because for him, Ruski are little Russians, great Russians, and white Russians. In the diaspora, Ukrainian identity is so conflated with the Ukrainian language that the concept of a patriotic Russian-speaking Ukrainian is beyond the comprehension of most diaspora Ukrainians as well. Well, they're going to have to think and change their minds because 2/3 of the people fighting on the front line on the Ukrainian side are Russian speakers, and this is basically a conflict between two groups of Russian speakers in many ways. Of course, there are many Ukrainian speakers on the Ukrainian side as well, but there's a lot of Russian speakers as well. And the problems with conscription and people turning up for call-up when they called up for conscription are in West Ukraine, not in East Ukraine. So the two oblasts with the lowest turn-up for people called for conscription are Zakarpattia and Ternopil Oblast. And you might think, Zakarpattia has always been a bit different, but Ternopil was always a bastion of Ukrainian nationalism. So, that's because some Galician Ukrainians have views similar to Alexander Motyl, which says, to hell with that region of Ukraine, to hell with that separatist enclave, let Russia take it. So, whereas if you're from Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Poltava, Zaporizhia, Odessa, you're right on the front line. If the western part of Donetsk Oblast falls, then next is Dnipropetrovsk, next is Zaporizhia. So you don't really have much choice there. Just the final thing on the volunteers. These volunteers who travel to the front line, the ones who stay in the various home bases and prepare things for the front line. They collect, they sew camouflage netting, they collect things. They're all practically women. I would say 90% women of all ages, from pensioners to young people. Most of these people are not those who were active previously in civil society. Some, of course, are from the Euromaidan, but not all of them. I would say many of them are not. Many of them are Russian speakers, and it's very it's very uplifting to see the activities of these women civil society volunteers, both in their bases and when they go to the front line with Natalia. They're really angels, and they all have the same kind of fighting spirit as Nadiya Savchenko. At the same time, it's very depressing that they have to do that. I mean, why should they be doing it when it should be the subject of the government supplying Ukrainian soldiers on the front line who are ready to give their lives for their country? I mean, it would just be beyond my comprehension if British and Canadian soldiers were reliant on volunteers to bring them food and medicines. I mean, we just wouldn't be able to understand that. In Ukraine, they kind of also find it unpleasant, but they accept it because they don't have a positive opinion of the people in power in Kyiv. For the last 25 years, public trust in state institutions and political leaders has been very low. Now, of course, they're not all the same. Particularly, the greatest amount of venom was directed by soldiers at the commander-in-chief. Understandably, he's responsible. He's a commander. And his opinion about him declined, of course, after the scandal with the Panama documents and Panama Papers. And let's remember that Ukraine has a free media. So these soldiers on the front line watch TV in the evenings if they're, in the base. They have mobile phones, so they're accessing social media. They go home on leave. So they have contact with the outside world. I mean, they know what's going on. They hear about the scandals and they read about this. It's not the same as in Russia where the media is controlled and people don't know what's going on with Putin and corruption. In Ukraine, they do. And that makes it more great attention because there's all this information out there, but then nobody goes to jail for it. There's still lack of accountability. So, you haven't got the Western system where you have, journalistic and criminal investigations, then some people go to jail. You haven't got the Russian system where there's complete silence. There's, media's controlled by the regime. So there's very little information and therefore nobody goes to jail. You've got the system in the middle where you've got democratic freedoms, democratic media, a lot of information, great investigations by journalists and civil society and some politicians, but then nothing happens. Nobody really goes to jail. So that obviously gets people's backs up, particularly when, they're on the front line and they've seen their colleagues. Now, in terms of who they relate to in Kyiv, they obviously have sympathies more with I would say, radical soldiers. I met with radical forces, with Batkivshina, Tymoshenko, with Samopomich, with Pravий sector maybe. Those would be the political forces they would at least try to look to. And, there is especially now with Nadiya Savchenko being a member of the Batkivshina faction in the Ukrainian parliament. But Poroshenko's ratings are declining. Narodny Front, Arseniy Yatsenyuk are somewhere in the doldrums. And of course, nobody supports the opposition bloc or the party regions. I mean, nobody there. So it's interesting to go there and to see this. It's particularly interesting because with the release of Nadiya Savchenko, you now have a potential moral leader of the voice of these soldiers. She's working in the Committee on National Security and Defense in the Ukrainian parliament, so she's their kind of moral voice, their lobbyist. And at the same time, you have a new factor in Ukrainian politics. You have first time ever, really, which is the army. This is a large number of people. These are soldiers who have fought, veterans who have previously fought, people who have been wounded, their families, their friends. We're talking 15, 20% of the voting population. It's a large group of people. And I'll end on this note, one of the things they all said, and we were on this trip, we were there the same week that Nadiya Savchenko was released. They all said the same thing as what she said when she was released, that we have to finish the Euromaidan. This is what many of the soldiers said. So for them, it's always been a two-front war. On the one hand, against Russian-backed proxies, and on the other hand, a war against politicians in Kyiv, like Poroshenko, who are failing to implement the demands of the Euromaidan. And for them, this is a two-front war. And that is why I'm pretty confident they will be successful because the pressure is on. The tide is in favor of, I would say, the pro-Europeanists. The people in Ukraine who psychologically and mentally have arrived in Europe, as it were. And that's the majority of the people. It's the majority of journalists, civil society, some political forces, particularly the radical ones, Samopomich, Batkivshina, maybe some nationalist forces. But then you have another group of people around the president who are blocking that, who kind of want to continue with this hybrid Ukraine, this pseudo-European, half Eurasian Ukraine. Ukraine's Tretí Shlach, abo Chumacki Shlach, something some different path. Thankfully, the third group, the pro-Russianists, the party regions, the communists, the opposition bloc, are too weak or marginal now to have any say. So really we're talking about confrontation not between previously three groups, Europeanists, hybrids, and pro-Russianists. Now it's just the hybrids versus Europeanists. And I think in that conflict, the Europeanists will come out on top because they have the backing of the soldiers, of Nadiya Savchenko, and of the majority of Ukrainian people. So in this sense, Poroshenko's holding the tide, which is going to eventually overwhelm him. I hope it doesn't turn out to be, in bloodshed. I hope it turns out to be non-violent. But that's always the danger, and that's why when you hear these soldiers talking on the front line and in their bases, it is so amazing to hear what kind of things that they say. And that's what makes it so fascinating going down there. And as I wrote in my critical review of Richard Sakwa, this British left-wing academic's book on the Euromaidan and the war, most people like him have never been down there, and yet they're writing about a subject they know nothing about. And hence they tend to give a very Russo-centric or Moscow-centric viewpoint. You need to go down there and talk to people and get a good understanding of how people are thinking and how what's driving them and what's driving that Ukrainian patriotism. Thank you.